Amen. In our last study, we went ahead and picked up, of course, in Esther chapter 6 and chapter 7. And we have seen, of course, that the tables had actually turned for wicked Haman. We have seen, of course, that Haman, the great enemy and hater of the Jews, tried to get his way with God's people. And so, of course, he went ahead and created an edict that was going to go ahead and wipe out the Jewish nation, wipe out the Jewish people throughout all 127 provinces. And so, it seemed that for a while that everything was going his way. And so, of course, till one morning he got up and he thought that, he was going to go straight to the King Ahasuerus, his best friend, his one of his favorite persons. And so he surely thought that, this is the day I get my way. Today is the day where I'm going to go ahead and wipe out wicked Mordecai, the Jew, and so forth. And so, he thought that everything was going to go his way, because after all, he was the really second person in command. I mean, people everywhere he went bowed down to him. They recognized him as such a person. He had the signet ring. He had the authority of the king. And so how could things go the wrong way? He had it all. He had it made. But of course, he got up that morning not knowing that the tables were going to be turned around, not knowing that he was going to go ahead and be doing the serving for Mordecai. And so, of course, he did the serving for Mordecai. The king actually came up to him and told him that actually he went to the king, and the king told him, what shall be done to the man whom the king wants to honor? And of course, automatically thought it was him. I mean, who else could he want to honor but me? And so he went ahead and gave his list, and to his surprise, the king went ahead and told him, go ahead and do that to Mordecai. And so then he got a face of reality of what was going on. Throughout the time here that we've spent in Esther, we have seen the Haman spirit. We have seen, of course, that Haman has been such a wicked guy. He hates God's people. They weren't really doing anything to him, but just because, he wanted honor and he wanted glory, and because Mordecai did not want to bow down to him, he begins to create this edict to go ahead and kill them and wipe them out. And so, of course, throughout the book of Esther, we have seen that the spirit of Haman is very well alive today. There's a lot of people that have that spirit. They hate the Jewish people. There's a lot of people that hate the Jewish people. I mean, we see in our own world today, we see, of course, in the Middle East, and we see even what is going on with our own nation, and how even our nation has been turning around their backs on Israel in that, in our current administration. That's very unfortunate, because, I do believe that the Jews are still God's chosen people, I mean, they're still considered as such. God has not finished with them, and we're going to be dealing with that in the book of Romans in the coming chapters. But there's a lot of people today that they hate the Jewish people. They don't like the Jews. They just have that Haman spirit. They want to get rid of the Jewish people. I mean, you have the Muslim nations, they hate the Jewish people, and they're going to try to get rid of them. And of course, we've seen that throughout history. The Haman spirit has been very well alive, even through the time of Hitler, and how he tried to annihilate the Jewish people. It's the same thing that Haman was doing, and the same thing that Haman wanted to do. And people, of course, that's the same thing that people want to do today, get rid of God's chosen people. And a lot of people, of course, get mad when that is said, that Israel is God's chosen people, but hey, that's the way it is. And, we got the scriptures out of them. God spoke to them and so forth. And whether people like it or not, that's really the way it is. And so, but as we see here in the coming chapters, people that are against the Jews, they're not going to win. I mean, if they get away with their wickedness in this life, they're one day going to stand before the Lord. They're one day going to die, and they're one day going to stand before the Lord, and they're going to give an account for everything that they have done against the Jews as well, and of course against everybody else. So Mordecai, of course, learned his lesson very well. And so he, of course, realized that he was messing with the wrong people because they had a living God. They had a powerful God. And so God had not wiped out his people yet, and God was not going to do that. And, God was not finished with them. And so he learned this lesson not to mess around with God's people. So, of course, Esther went ahead and invited the king and Haman as well to the banquet a couple of times. And so, of course, more pride in him. And he, of course, thought that, yes, now I'm going to get my way because, hey, after all, I'm the one that the queen's inviting. And, the king has me there. So I'm going to seize on that opportunity and try to get rid of this Mordecai one way or the other and against his people. And, of course, remember the time was coming where it was going to be law to where you can go ahead and kill the Jewish people if you pleased. And so he was, of course, looking forward to that. And so, he, of course, began to hear Esther saying and telling her husband, telling the king, to save her because her life and the life of her people, there was someone that wanted to, take it away. And, of course, it's like, who is this? And, of course, this is that man, Haman. And, of course, he started to tremble. He started to get scared. The king, of course, became a little bit perhaps frustrated. He walked outside to the garden to perhaps get some fresh air and begin to think things out. And there, of course, or most likely, he probably began to think, how could I let this wicked Haman do such thing? And so he went back in, and by that time, of course, he saw that his wife was on the bed, and then you have this wicked Haman there lying across the bed, touching her and reaching towards her and pleading for his life. And so he freaks out and, he wants to attack my wife like that as well. And, of course, they cover his face and then they kill him. So now, of course, things have been totally different because Haman was killed. Haman was hanged on the gallows that he had made for Mordecai, his enemy. And so now here in Esther chapter 8, then we see in verse 1 and verse 2 that it says, on that day did the king Ahasuerus give the house of Haman the Jews' enemy unto Esther the queen. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was unto her. And the king took off his ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it unto Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. So now, of course, we see that the tables have turned. We see, of course, that, the power of the enemy has been overthrown. And so Haman, of course, has been overthrown. And so he has no more authority and no more power over the Jewish people because he's dead. And so, once again, people will always stand against God and against his people, but they're on the losing side. And just like today, people that stand against God, people that go against God's people, that speak against us and speak against what we stand for, yeah, they are speaking like that, full of pride and, with that wicked spirit, like if they're never going to die and they're never going to give an answer for everything that they say against God's people and against God himself. But they will. So we see here, of course, that there's now a little bit more of a breathing room in regards, just temporarily in regards to Esther and to Mordecai, because for a while, they probably thought that they were goners. For a while, they no doubt were on their knees and on fasting and just praying. And remember that Esther had requested Mordecai to tell the Jewish people throughout the 127 provinces, to pray and to fast because of what she was going to do. And of course, now knowing that this the date was coming up, they had probably about 8 to 9, 10 months or so to prepare. And they knew that the date where it was going to be legal for the Jews to get killed, it was coming. And so no doubt that they started to implore more and to pray more, to fast more, because they saw that they were still in danger. But now, even though Mordecai is gone, they're still in danger because that day is still coming. You see, but now, of course, they got rid of Mordecai, or actually the Lord got rid of Mordecai. But Have you ever thought that, Esther and Mordecai and the other Jewish people, of course, they still had to go through that. So they still had to go through, through their thoughts, through their emotions, through their thinking, man, there's an enemy right before us. He wants to kill us. He hates us. They still had to go through that. And the Lord was allowing them to go through that. And of course, we don't understand why God works the way he does, but, God could have so easily wiped out wicked Haman the moment that Haman even had that thought, or the moment that he started to show disrespect to the Jews and to Mordecai. But God didn't do that. God still allowed them to go through that hardship, through that thinking that, man, we're going to get wiped out. Here's an enemy that's given us such a hard time, and of course, that just caused Esther and caused Mordecai and caused the Jewish people to really rely more on God. I often think why God really works the way he does. I mean, especially when I go through or when we go through difficult situation, or we've gone through difficult situations, and I've questioned God, no doubt. Esther and Mordecai questioned God as well. It's like, Lord, why is this happening, Lord? I mean, come on, we're your people. We've been in Babylon going on 70 years, and now you're allowing this to take place. And so, why God? And you begin to question God during those times. And you know what? To be totally honest with you, I mean, when we've gone through difficult situations and the enemy has been right there before us and before me, I've questioned God. I haven't really passed that test with flying colors. I can't say that. I would be lying. But I've questioned God. God, why is this, this enemy right before me? Why is this happening? But one thing I've learned is that God will allow us to go through the most difficult situations, even those situations that we think that, it's just so hard that we can't, bear it. God will allow us to go through that for a couple of reasons. One is so that we can trust more in him. That's one thing I've learned. And I've learned to trust more in the Lord, even going through those situations, and it brought me closer to Christ. I don't like it. I mean, there's been times that, I've cried, and I've cried like a baby. I'm not in front of my wife, for those times, and she didn't even know about those times. I mean, I've gone out to the car and I've just cried because sometimes it's just so unbearable. But I've learned that God will use that, to allow me to trust more in him. That's the way it works. And so I don't like it, though. And I still don't like it. And for me, if I was God, it's like, oh, you're going to mess with Greg? Boom, right there. Bam, just annihilate him right there and then. I mean, that's the way we think that God should work, but God doesn't work like that. So, so Esther and Mordecai still had to go through that, because I do see that in Scripture that they began to rely more and their faith grew more. So then, Mordecai, of course, is going to be getting rewarded. Mordecai gets rewarded. Esther gets rewarded, of course, for everything that they've gone through. And so Haman, remember that he was a very, not only wicked, but he was a very wealthy man. I mean, he was a very wealthy, he had a lot of riches in that. And of course, remember that he boasted of his riches. And so all of that was given now over unto Esther. I mean, everything that belonged to Haman was given over unto Esther. And so that, of course, meant that wicked Haman's family and everything that they had no longer belonged to them. It was now given unto Esther in that. And you know why that happens? You know why that the Lord allowed that to take place? So everybody can see, that they are God's chosen people. So that everybody can see, and everyone throughout the whole 127 provinces can see that, hey, you know what? This is what God's enemies actually get in return for messing with my people. we see, of course, we see now in verse 3 that it says this. And Esther spoke yet again before the king and fell down at his feet and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite and his device that he had devised against the Jews. So we see, of course, that yes, Haman's out of the way now, but his edict is still alive. His edict is still alive, and they can't. We know, of course, according to this chapter, that it can't be revoked. And so now what are they going to do? So they're still imploring on the Lord. They're still crying unto the Lord. They're still, trusting in the Lord in that. And so she's still going to go, of course, take a step of faith and go unto the king, because the edict was still alive in that. So Esther spoke yet again before the king and fell down at his feet and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman the Agagites and his device that he had devised against the Jews. Then the king held out the golden scepter towards Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king. Remember that back in Esther chapter 4, remember when when Mordecai found out of Haman's wicked plot to go ahead and annihilate the Jewish people and make it legal. Remember that he sent word unto Esther of what was going on to go in and speak to the king. And remember that Esther back then said that I haven't seen the king in 30 days and I can't go because, everyone knows that it's the law. If you go before the king, it is illegal. If he doesn't extend the scepter out unto you, they'll be killed right away. So I can't do that. And then, of course, remember that Mordecai sent word again unto Esther after he received that word. And it's like, if you think that you're going to escape, then you are so wrong. And then you are there for such a time as this. And so she's now taking another step of faith here. Yes, they've beaten Haman for now. The edict is still alive, but she still has to take a few steps of faith. And so she is taking a step of faith here because she has not been called. It is still against the law. And so if the king, of course, does not extend that golden scepter, then she's going to get killed. But one thing we've seen throughout the book of Esther is that God is always at work, even though when, you don't see him there, even though, Esther and Mordecai did not see the Lord, and God was still working there. We see that his hand was all over this book. We see that his hand was all over, the guiding here. Even when wicked Haman was doing everything that he was doing, even though when it seemed that Haman was way on top and he was going to annihilate the Jewish people, God was still at work. God had prepared the way because he knew that there was a guy named Haman, and he knew that Haman was going to try to get rid of his people. And so he put the people at the right place at the right time. And those that were going to take a step of faith to step up and to speak, of course, unto the king in that. So God had everything under control. And then in verse 5 it says, and so Esther is speaking and said, if it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seems right before the king, and I be pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews which are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that shall come unto my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? Then the king Ahasuerus said unto Esther the queen and to Mordecai the Jew, Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and him they have hanged upon the gallows, because he laid his hand upon the Jews. Write ye also for the Jews as it likes you, or as you want to, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's ring. For the writing which is written in the king's name, and seal it with the king's ring, may no man reverse. So, Esther, of course, she still loves her people. She knows that edict is still alive, and she still has to do something because God has placed her there for such a time as this. And so she knows that if she doesn't do anything, then what's going to happen is a lot of Jewish people are going to get killed. And she can't allow that to happen because her cousin Mordecai can end up getting killed as well. And, the right thing to do would be to plead unto the king. And so she does, because she loves her people. And so she's pleading unto the king. And of course, now, since the tables have turned, now, of course, what Mordecai needs to do is now he needs to create his own edict. And that way he can go ahead and protect his people. But that previous edict, Haman's wicked edict, could not be overturned. And so now, of course, he's going to go ahead and create his own. Then in verse 9, it says this, then were the king's scribes called at that time in the 3rd month, that is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day thereof. And it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded unto the Jews and to the lieutenants and the deputies and rulers of the provinces, which are from India unto Ethiopia, 127 provinces, unto every province according to the writing thereof, and unto every people after their language, and to the Jews according to their writing and according to their language. Bible commentators believe that this actually took place on June 25th, 474 BC, and that's when they believe that this edict actually came out in that. So then in verse 10 it says, and he wrote in the king Ahasuerus' name, and sealed it with the king's ring, and sent letters by post on horseback, and riders on mules, camels, and young dromedaries. And that is believed to be either some of the best horses or actually a camel, some of the best camels in that. So verse 11, wherein the king granted the Jews which were in every city to gather themselves together and to stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, and to cause to perish all the power of the people and province that would assault them, both little ones and women, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. So now, of course, the rule is that the Jewish people, of course, can go ahead and protect themselves and end up killing anyone that turns, that wants to kill them. And so the previous edict could not be overturned. So now this is actually what, he turns into law, and immediately they begin to rush it. As we read there, they begin to rush it throughout the whole 127 provinces. And so now they can go ahead and protect themselves in that. And they could go ahead and take the spoil if they wish of their enemies in that. But when the war takes place, actually when the battle begins, they're not going to be taking the spoil, and we'll go ahead and see why that is. So they're not going to go ahead and take the spoil of their enemies, and I think it's because of something very interesting that we've addressed before, and so with the Amalekites, it has to do something with King Saul. So we'll speak about that in a little bit. Then it goes on to say in verse 12, upon one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, namely, upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, the copy of the writing for a commandment to be given in every province was published unto all people, and that the Jews should be ready against that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. So the posts that rode upon mules and camels went out, being hastened and pressed on by the king's commandment, and the decree was given at Shushan the palace. And Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, and with a great crown of gold, and with a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, whatsoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a good day. And many of the people of the land became Jews, for the fear of the Jews fell upon them. So now we see, of course, here that God is beginning to get glorified in this, because now they're seeing that the Jewish people, are not going to get wiped out. Now they see that the tables have actually turned, and now they see that Mordecai is in Haman's place where Haman used to be at. And so now they see that God is with them, and Sometimes, sometimes it takes um, drastic changes like this for people to realize that. You know, and what I've seen, and I've seen this through history also, and what I've seen is that God gets people's attention with just difficult times, difficult situations. When their life is in danger, and that that's really when a lot of people is like immediately become religious. So now the people that are throughout the 127 provinces, now they're seeing that, wait a minute. Before wicked Haman was there, but now there's a Jew that replaced Haman. Now there is a Jew there that is leading with the king, and Esther is a Jew as well. And so now they're beginning to see that God is with them. Perhaps all of this has actually reminded them of the Jewish history, because the Jews, they have such a rich history, and none of that was kept in secret. And so they perhaps were reminded of everything that God has done for the Jewish people throughout history. That God has, yes, allowed them to be taken captive to Babylon, but God has always been with them as well. And so now they see that, and now a lot of them actually are becoming Jews. That is, they're getting proselytized into the Jewish religion. Now they're beginning to believe in the God of the Jews. Because, if their God can do such a drastic change, He is a powerful God. And so now they're seeing that. And so now they're beginning to believe in the Jewish God, and that. So they're becoming Jews. That is, they're becoming believers in the Jewish religion in that. So then in Esther chapter 9, it goes on to read in verse 1, "Now in the 20th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's commandment and his decree drew near to be put in execution, in the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them, though it was turned to the contrary, that the Jews had rule over them that hated them. The Jews gathered themselves together in their cities throughout all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus, to lay hand on such as sought their hurt, and no man could withstand them, for the fear of them fell upon all people. And all the rulers of the provinces, and the lieutenants, and the deputies, and officers of the king helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them." So they see this, of course, this drastic change. And even with this drastic change, there's still wicked people out there. And, they're just waiting for that day. They're waiting for the day to where it's going to be legal to kill the Jews. And there's still a lot of people. And you know who's still waiting there? The Amalekites. And wicked Haman's 10 sons are still waiting there. Now, of course, they're in shame. Now, of course, they don't have access to the king. Now they have public shame. And so now they're waiting, even with more of a hatred, for that day to kill the Jewish people. And they're going to take an opportunity and try to kill Jewish people. But, of course, they're going to get killed. And so, people will still hate the Jewish people. And even when the day comes, of course, and it's coming here, and they're going to get wiped out. So now, of course, God is with his people, and he is protecting them. And so now the fear of the Jewish people have fallen upon all the other people. That is, now, of course, they're fearing them, because now they're seeing, wait a minute, now they used to be the minority before. Now they're the majority. Now God is on their side. And so then verse 3, once again, it says, "And all the rulers of the provinces, and the lieutenants, and the deputies, and officers of the king helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them." So now they have the law as well. And so now the captains and all those that were in the king's army, now they're helping the Jews to annihilate those that hate them. And so then in verse 4 it says, "For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame went out throughout all the provinces, for this man Mordecai waxed greater and greater. Now you see something, that God is fulfilling his promise. God in Genesis chapter 12, when he called Abram, called him out of the land of his fathers, to leave that and to go and follow him to a land, of course, that he was going to show him. God actually gave a promise there to Abraham, and that promise still stands today. A lot of people might disagree with it, but that promise still stands today, and we see that it will stand throughout the book of Revelation, throughout the 7 years, the last years of world history, through the tribulation period. God told Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, and I will bless them that bless you, and curse him that curses you. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. That promise still stands today, because God is not done with his people. Even though the Jewish people rejected the Messiah, even though they are pagans right now, even though the nation as a whole is not recognizing Jesus as their promised Messiah, God still will keep his promise to Abraham. And Genesis 12:3 still stands. And so that is why, I believe that those that go against Israel, those that hate the Jewish people, they are against God in every way. And I firmly believe this, and nobody's going to change my mind. I can't understand how a true born-again Christian can hate the Jewish people, can speak against, and go against the Jewish people. I can't understand how that is possible. I don't think it's possible. That's not possible because, prior to becoming a Christian, I really didn't know anything about the Jews. I just knew that they were used as a byword. They were used as jokes. But after I became a Christian, the Lord just started to put a love in my heart for the Jewish people. And I love the Jewish people. I love the nation of Israel. I will stand with Israel. And I truly believe that everyone that is right with God will love the Jewish people. And God will keep his word. I believe Genesis 12:3, and I believe that it still stands today. And I believe that those that might call themselves Christian and that hate the Jewish people, I don't think they're Christian at all, because I can't understand how that is possible. It's not possible. And so you see that now the enemies, the Lord has turned the tables on the Jews' enemies and his enemies. So now you see that they're going to get wiped out, and that's going to be the end result of everyone that hates God and everyone that hates God's people. The Lord is going to turn the tables around, and they're going to get wiped out. So we see that God is still working with the nation of Israel, and he's still going to work with the nation of Israel even in the last days. Even when they're going to go into the temple in the middle of the 3.5 years, and the Antichrist is going to go ahead and declare that he is God. Right there, of course, their scales are going to open. They're going to realize that he's not the Messiah. They killed the true Messiah, and they're going to run. They're going to go to the city of Petra, and they're going to hide in there. And of course, that's where Jesus speaks about in Matthew 24. In that, those that are on the housetop flee. Woe unto those that are with child in those days. And God is still going to be with the Jews there. God's going to protect them from the enemy in that. And so God here is going to get rid of those that hate his people. And then in verse 5, it says, thus the Jews smote all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, and slaughter and destruction, and did what they would unto those that hated them. Now, Something, something that's very interesting. We've touched on this before. Is that this actually could have been avoided had there been obedience. This actually could have been avoided, had Saul actually obeyed God's word. Remember that in, I think it's 1 Samuel chapter 15. Remember that Samuel had actually sent Saul, and of course God was the one that told Samuel to tell Saul, but Samuel had actually sent Saul to wipe out all the Amalekites. And so, of course, he goes with his people to battle, and they kill many of them, but they save Agag, the king, alive. And then they keep the best of the spoils. They keep the best of everything. And, one of the instructions was to wipe them all out and to don't pick up any of the spoils. But unfortunately, Saul, now being in a rebellious state, against God, he disobeyed God. And he went, he didn't kill Agag the king, he kept him alive. Of course, Samuel ended up chopping him into pieces after that. But we see, of course, that, when he was approaching Samuel, Samuel tells him, what is this that I hear? And then, of course, Saul says, well, this is the best of the spoils. And I've saved it, to sacrifice it unto the Lord. But that was against God's word. And so that, all of this here that we're reading, the book of Esther actually could have been avoided. The actions in the book of Esther could have been avoided had Saul killed all the Amalekites. Because remember that wicked Haman, he was a member. He was a member of the Amalekites. And it is believed that he was a direct descendant of Agag, the king. And many Bible commentators actually teach this, and many pastors as well. They teach that the Amalekites in Scripture is actually a type of the flesh. And they say that, one of the reasons that a lot of people are in problems today is because they did not kill their flesh. And of course, you go to Romans chapter 6, and in Scripture, it does tell you, of course, to, put to death the flesh. I mean, it is dead, consider it dead. But because a lot of people don't, a lot of Christians don't, they're disobedient, they don't put to death the flesh, then what happens, that flesh will catch up with them. Their disobedience and their rebellion will catch up to them later, and then they will end up dealing with the consequences of that disobedience, because it does catch up. It will catch up. And in a way, I believe that to be true, that the Amalekites are a type of the flesh, because, had King Saul actually wiped out the entire Amalekites as he was commanded by the Lord, this could have been avoided. And should people be obedient to God and put away their flesh, put away their desires of the flesh, they will not end up dealing with the consequences of their sin later on. And one of the reasons that, and I've seen this throughout my ministerial life, one of the reasons that a lot of people are in trouble today is because they were led by the flesh in the past. One of the reasons that a lot of people are getting divorced today, or are going through, those difficult times, even marital problems and that and everything else, is because they did not put the flesh to die. I think that a lot of problems can actually be avoided if people are obedient to God. So, this could have been avoided had Saul, King Saul, killed the Amalekites. But because he didn't, now the Jews are dealing with the Amalekites. And so, when God told the Jews, when they were about to go into the land, and through Joshua, he told them to go ahead and wipe out the enemies, wipe out the pagans in that, because if not, then they're going to turn your hearts against me. When we went through the book of Joshua and we continued on through Judges in that, we saw that they did not do that. We saw that the Jewish people, those that entered the promised land, they became disobedient. They did not kill their enemies. They did not follow through God's word. And so then, of course, they later on started to deal with the consequences of that disobedience. I truly believe that if we are obedient to God's word and not let the flesh rule over us or the flesh make decisions for us, we can avoid so many problems in the future. I do believe that. And so then in verse 6, excuse me, verse 6 and on it says, "And in Shushan the palace the Jews slew and destroyed 500 men, and Parshan, Detha, and Dalphon, and Aspatha, and Poratha, and Adelia, and Aridatha, and Parmashtha, and Arisai, and Aridai, and Vajisetha." You know these names here, it's good I'm not getting graded on the pronunciation of these names, right? So please, Sister Nora, don't send me a report card for this. And so then in verse 10 says, "Then the sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, slew they, but on the spoil laid they not their hand." So you see here, of course, that it's mentioned here that they didn't lay their hands on the spoil. And then also it's mentioned in the end of verse 16 that they did not lay their hands on the spoil. And once again, why do you think that is? Well, I think it's my belief here, and it's my opinion here that I think that the reason that they did not get a hold of that spoil, because just imagine 800 men only there were killed in Shushan, in the main city there. 800 men. A lot of these men perhaps were very wealthy and so forth. They could have had a lot of spoils, but they didn't take any of it. They were not interested in the spoils. They were just interested in defending themselves. And so it is my belief that the reason that they're not taking the spoil is because I think that they have remembered, King Saul's disobedience. And they know that Haman was an Amalekite, and a lot of the people that are trying to get rid of them are Amalekites. And so I think that they just don't want to fall into that same sin. I think they want to be totally obedient with everything. And so I think they're remembering Saul's disobedience and how he took all the spoils, so they just want to avoid that. They don't want to be touching the wicked thing there. And so then, excuse me, in verse 11, "On that day the number of those that were slain in Shushan the palace was brought before the king. And the king said unto Esther the queen, The Jews have slain and destroyed 500 men in Shushan the palace, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is thy petition? And it shall be granted thee. For what is thy request further? And it shall be done." Then Esther said, "If it please the king, let it be granted to the Jews which are in Shushan to do tomorrow also according unto this day's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged upon the gallows." Excuse me. And the king commanded so to be done, and the decree was given at Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. So, this, of course, is just shows the people more that God is with them. That anyone that stands against the Jews, or anyone that stands against them, and they will be standing against God, and God's going to reverse the tables in that. So, it's just a public display that God's going to wipe out his enemies. And so I believe that's why Esther has actually asked this request here. So just imagine, the 10 sons there, they wanted revenge, and they wanted that day. They were counting the days to where they could go ahead and kill the Jews. And so they get wiped out. They of course tried to avenge the death of their father, but it shows that they were wicked men as well. It shows that their father had taught them very well, how to hate the Jews, especially when he would come in, and speak to his wife and his family on how this Mordecai doesn't bow down, and how they found out, or when they heard about the edict that their father had created. Oh yes, Dad, yes, wipe them out and so forth. He taught them very well, but you see, they learned the hard lesson as well. And so then verse 14, and the king commanded it so to be done. And the decree was given at Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. For the Jews that were in Shushan gathered themselves together on the 14th day also on the month of Adar, and slew 300 men at Shushan, but on the prey they laid not their hand. So a total of men that they killed only in the palace there in Shushan were 800 men. I mean, that's only one city. Just imagine 127 provinces. It is actually believed that more than 75,000 men, people were killed throughout the whole provinces. Those that wanted to just destroy the Jewish people. And so, that could be the number, and it could actually be a lot more, or could be a little bit less. But I mean, there were a lot of people that hated the Jewish people, and so. But here in Shushan, 800 people went ahead and got killed because they hated the Jews. Now we of course see that they started to celebrate this victory here. So now, verse 16, it says, "But the other Jews that were in the king's provinces gathered themselves together and stood for their lives, and had rest from their enemies, and slew of their foes 5,000, but they laid not their hands on the prey." And of course, once again, 75,000 is a round number there. "On the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day of the same rested they, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews that were in Shushan assembled together on the 13th day thereof, and on the 14th thereof, and on the 15th day of the same they rested, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages that dwell in the walled towns made the 14th day of the month Adar a day of gladness and feasting, and a good day, and of sending portion one to another." So because of this here, you have, of course, the Feast of Purim. And so that's where it originates here. And so, they made it into law. And so since then, they've been celebrating the Feast of Purim. And so this year, actually, it was celebrated on Wednesday, March the 4th, and then ended on Thursday, March the 5th. And so, it's celebrated 2 days because of the both days that they fought in that. So, and if you guys remember, I think it's really when we were starting the book of Esther, or we were 1 or 2 chapters into the book of Esther. Remember that the Prime Minister of Israel, when he made his speech, he actually brought up Esther. And he brought up also, I think he brought up this feast, but he brought up Esther. And so, just reminding, of course, them that God's going to be standing with them in that. So then in verse 20 it says, "And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters unto all the Jews that were all in all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus, both near and far, to establish this among them, that they should keep the 14th day of the month Adar, and the 15th day of the same yearly, as the day wherein the Jews rested from their enemies, and the month which was turned unto them for sorrow, from sorrow to joy, and from mourning into a good day, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, and of sending portions one to another and gifts to the poor. And the Jews undertook to do as they had begun, as Mordecai had written unto them, because Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had devised against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast that is, the lot, to consume them and to destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letters that his wicked device, which he devised against the Jews, should return upon his own head. and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Wherefore they call these days Purim after the name of Pur. Therefore, for all the words of this letter and of that which they had seen concerning this matter, and which had come unto them, the Jews ordained and took upon them, and upon their seed, and upon all such as joined themselves unto them, so as it should not fail, that they would keep these 2 days according to their writing, and according to their appointed time every year. And that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city. And that these days of Purim should not fail from among the Jews, nor nor the memorial of them perish from their seed. So whenever this feast actually takes place, they refer back to this story. And so, they're reminded of how God went ahead and delivered them from their enemies again. So verse 29, then Esther the queen, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew wrote with all authority to confirm the second letter of Purim. And he sent the letters unto all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus with words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim in their times appointed, according as Mordecai the Jew and Esther the queen had enjoined them, and as they had decreed for themselves and for their seed the matters of the fastings and their cry. And the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. So, we're reading it. Then chapter 10, and this is one of the shortest chapters. Verse 1, and the king Ahasuerus laid a tribute upon the land and upon the isles of the sea, and all the acts of his power and his mights, and the declaration of the greatness of Mordecai, whereunto the king advanced him. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was next unto the king Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and accepted of the multitudes of his brethren, seeking the wealth of his people and speaking peace to all his seed. So these books, of course, that are mentioned here, the Chronicles of the Kings of Media and of Persia, we don't have access to those books. We don't know if they still exist. Perhaps they exist, somewhere in a hidden library underneath some building that hasn't been discovered in that. But it would be interesting if one day these books that are mentioned, these historical books, even of Persia and that, if they were found one day. I mean, it would confirm a lot, of course, of what is written. And not that we need those books. It doesn't change God's truth, but it's just additional, of course, archaeological and historical finds that would be very interesting. Archaeologists are always finding just great artifacts that confirm, the historical accounts of the biblical events. And but even with that, I mean, when something is found, people still don't believe. They just choose not to believe. But hey, they're losing on that. So, well, we are done with the book of Esther. So, the book of Job is next. And, the book of Job, it's a very interesting book. And so we're going to really go through it in detail. And I think, we'll be learning a lot as to why God allows what he allows. And so many times we don't understand why God allows the things that he allows. I mean, you look at Job and you see that, man, he suffered. He was a righteous guy. He was a righteous man. I mean, righteous in all his ways. And God still allowed him to suffer tremendously with all of this here. But he did curse, of course, the day that he was born, but he wasn't cursing his God, so he didn't sin against God. And so we're going to go through that, and if there is a book that is very applicable to our lives, it's the book of Job. Because You know, why does God do the things He does? So we're going to go ahead and answer those questions here in the book of Job. So let's pray, shall we?